happy September 16th from Flute Tube. This is going to be my first ever Flute Tube episode that I'm posting not on a Friday. This year, September 16th falls on a Monday, but I'm going to do it because there's a big Flute Tube VIP who has a birthday on September 16th, and that is Nadia Boulanger. Happy birthday to Nadia Boulanger. Nadia Boulanger is absolutely one of my personal musical heroes. She lived September 16th, 1887 until October 22nd, 1979. If you're a musician, chances are good you already know a little bit about Nadia Boulanger, or maybe a lot about Nadia Boulanger. You probably know that most of her legacy is in the vast array of eclectic 20th century composers that she taught and other world-class musicians. She felt composers and other musicians should all be equally trained in musicianship skills. But many of the very top composers of the 20th century spoke with pride about being students of Nadia Boulanger. There's far too much for me to say about Nadia Boulanger to put in one single episode of Flute Tube, so I'm not even going to try. If you don't know about her, or you don't know enough about her, use her birthday today as a reason to learn more. What I want to do today is tell you a few of the stories that I've learned about Nadia Boulanger from musicians in my life that I've run into over the course of my career, wonderful world-class musicians who studied with her and told me personal stories that you're unlikely to find in any history books. I'm going to tell you 3 stories that I learned from musicians about Nadia Boulanger that I myself learned from them while I was working at the École Normale de Musique in Paris over the summers. The École Normale is a school where Nadia herself taught for many years. I taught there and elsewhere in Paris, mostly during the summers from 2006 until such summer programs were shut down by COVID around 2020. When I first saw this photograph of Nadia Boulanger around 2014 or so, I had quite a strong reaction. It kind of made my skin prickle because she's sitting exactly where I had by then stood teaching for many hours of my life. She's pictured here in Salle Munch, the big main teaching space at the École Normale de Musique in Paris. The first story I want to tell you today is one that I heard from pianist Emile Naoumoff one summer while he and I were both teaching in Paris. If I were in court right now, I should definitely not be the one telling you this story. It should be Emile at the witness stand, because obviously what I'm going to tell you involves a lot of hearsay. I was not there. But this story Emile told was about a talk that he had at least once with Aaron Copland, because Copland had been a student and remained a friend of Nadia Boulanger for many years, and Emile was one of Nadia's very last disciples. Her students called themselves her disciples because they immersed themselves so completely in her teaching methods. So as I say, Copland was a student from earlier in her career teaching. She taught Copland when she was in her mid-30s and he was in his early 20s. At that young point in his life, Copland had already gained a lot of attention as a composer. It really mattered to him that he be highly successful as a composer, because all the signs were there that he could be. And he was thinking really deeply about where to study, what his best course would be to train himself to be the best composer possible. He'd received these glowing letters from people that he knew about Nadia Boulanger, but she was relatively young. She didn't have her decades-long career established yet. Copland came towards the beginning of that. And so he told Emile Naoumoff that what he did while he was thinking about studying with Nadia Boulanger is he went to the library and he looked up all the bios of composers that he could think of, major composers. He pulled out encyclopedias. He searched through all these resources at the library, trying to find any major composers who had studied with a woman. And he couldn't find any. And so he was a bit worried about going to study with Nadia, wondering if he was going to put himself on track to become really a major composer. But because of all he'd heard and because she was in Paris, and Paris was a great place for musicians to go study, he did go study with her, and he instantly became aware that she was exactly what he needed to hone his musicianship skills and his craft as a composer. She was so powerfully intelligent in general, and specifically about music, that he decided to revise his plans, and instead of staying there to study with her for 1 year as he had initially planned, he stayed for 3. The second of these stories that I want to tell you today came from my dear friend Narcis Bonet. When I met Bonet in 2006, he was probably the sunniest, most optimistic, just radiating joy personality that I'd ever met. And that's how everyone saw him, this ray of sunshine. He passed away in 2019, but he was also a disciple of Nadia Boulanger, one of her very closest, who worked with her for many years. He, in 1979, succeeded her to become the director of her very famous school for composition and musicianship at Fontainebleau. This is a very famous, especially among composers, Conservatoire Américain de Fontainebleau. Narcis Bonet and Nadia Boulanger were very close friends and colleagues, and Narcis Bonet especially gave her aid as she got older and she started to lose her eyesight and her hearing as well. There was an international competition that they would go to and judge together, and every year they would get there a day early so that Nadia, who couldn't see the submitted scores at that time, would go and listen through them with Narcis Bonet. They would get the huge pile of submitted scores and sit at the piano all day long, the day before the other judges would arrive, and Narcis Bonet would play through them at the piano so that Nadia could have an understanding of what was going on with each score before the other judges arrived. And the story that Narcis Bonet told is that it was just incredible what she could remember from that time listening through the scores, that when the other judges arrived and they would all together look through these scores, and Nadia still couldn't really look at the scores, she still was in this amazing leadership position to intelligently assess these composers. And she would remember details that he couldn't believe that she could remember, that she would say something like, oh yes, this piece starts in a very intriguing way, but when you get to about the 4th or 5th page of the score, there's this moment of counterpoint between these two instruments that you really should pay attention to. It's a little bit weak right there, that kind of detail. Incidentally, as a little side story, Narcis Bonet said that one year there was a composer from a less affluent background. He really didn't have any money, and he was a good contender, but he didn't win. And so Nadia gave Narcis some money and said, I want you to go to the casinos and gamble and do your very best and see what you can get together to give to this composer so that he can go home with something. And so I won't go into too much detail about that gambling story because that's really Narcis's story, not so much Nadia's story. But I thought it was very funny and touching that she would want to give this composer who didn't win an award something. And Narcis Bonet assured us he did his very best gambling because he did not want to let either Nadia or this composer down. And he did come up with something to give to this rising young composer. The last story that I want to tell today belongs to Emile Naoumoff, whom I've already mentioned. This story involves himself, though, rather than Copland. Emile, as I mentioned, was one of Nadia's very last disciples towards the end of her life, one of the very last ones that she took on. And as she was getting older, Emile said that she became quite reclusive. She really liked to be at her house, and she wouldn't want to go out into the world and deal with people at large. And he felt very privileged that he was one of the few people that she was willing to have come over and wanted to have him come visit her at her house. By then she'd really lost her eyesight and she'd really lost a lot of her hearing as well. But when Emile went over to see her, he said that she always had projects to do. She was always mentally active and very incisive and intelligent and sharp up to the end of her life. He said that when he would visit her, she would often ask him to solfege with her through Bach fugues. So she would name some Bach fugue, probably from the Well-Tempered Clavier, and maybe it was a 3 or 4 or 5 voice fugue, and she would say, "You solfege this voice, and I will solfege this voice." And she couldn't see them. She probably couldn't have been able to see them for quite a while at that time. But he said that she knew all these different voices. She could solfege all these different voices of all these different Bach fugues, which if you think about, she died in 1979. She was born in 87, and these are the final years of her life in her 90s. She remembered all of these Bach fugues that well. And Emile said that sometimes he would ask her, "Wouldn't you like to go outside? I could help you go outside and see people." And she would say, "Why should I want to go see people? I have the very best possible company here with me in my house. My days are peopled with Bach fugues." I hope that especially if you have any of the same feelings of respect for such a consummate musician that I have, someone who really paved the way and opened doors and helped so many great musicians achieve their full potential, that this video has meant a little something to you today on Nadia Boulanger's birthday. Of course, one of the things that Nadia was most famous for, which I haven't even mentioned, is teaching her also exceptionally gifted younger sister, Lili. And I've been playing Lili's Nocturne a little bit during this video. There are endless things we could talk about today regarding Nadia, but I wanted to tell you some stories that you probably won't find elsewhere unless you become friends with Emile Naoumoff, but Narcis Bonet is no longer with us. I'll wrap this up without saying any more of the many things that could be said about Nadia Boulanger, but I want to leave you with just a few quotes from her so we feel like she's here with us. She said, "Life is denied by lack of attention, whether it be to cleaning windows or trying to write a masterpiece. Also, feeling the pulse is not counting. Counting is counting. Do not take up music unless you would rather die than not do so. I've been a woman for a little over 50 years and have gotten over my initial astonishment. As for conducting an orchestra, that's a job where I don't think sex plays much part."